Children's laughter mixed with the music of the carousel until one scream cut through the air sharper than the knife in the raffle tent. The sound came from Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, the vicar's wife, who had been arranging prize ribbons for the jam competition when she stumbled backward into the fortune-teller's booth. Her face had gone the color of fresh chalk, and her trembling finger pointed toward the striped canvas of the raffle tent, where something dark was seeping through the cheerful red and white fabric onto the grass below. Inside, among the donated prizes, a hand-knitted sweater, a bottle of elderflower wine, 3 pounds of Mrs. Hartwell's prize-winning marmalade, lay the body of Colonel Archibald Whitmore, face down beside an overturned basket of lavender sachets. The ivory handle of what appeared to be a letter opener protruded from between his shoulder blades, and scattered around him were dozens of raffle tickets, their bright colors now stained with something much darker than ink. The St. Mary Mead. Summer Fête had been in full swing that warm July afternoon. Bunting fluttered between the ancient oak trees that bordered the village green, and the air was thick with the scent of roses from the rectory garden and the competing aromas of frying onions from the sausage stand and fresh scones from the Women's Institute tent. Children ran between the stalls with sticky fingers and gap-toothed grins, their mothers following behind with weary smiles and empty purses. It had been, until that moment, the sort of perfectly ordinary English summer afternoon that postcards were made of, the kind where the greatest excitement might have been Mrs. Weatherby's Victoria Sponge winning first prize for the 3rd consecutive year, or young Timothy Fletcher getting his head stuck between the railings of the duck pond again. But murder has a way of transforming even the most innocent of settings into something altogether more sinister. The carousel continued its tinkling melody for several moments after Mrs. Pemberton's scream, the painted horses rising and falling with their frozen smiles carrying children who had not yet realized that something terrible had happened just 20 yards away. It was Mr. Clement, the carousel operator, who finally brought the ride to a grinding halt when he noticed the sudden exodus of adults from the raffle tent and the way conversations had stopped mid-sentence all across the green. Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham within the hour, his black Ford Anglia kicking up dust as it pulled onto the grass beside the cricket pavilion. He was a man of middle years, with a face that suggested he had seen too much of the world's ugliness to be easily surprised by it, though the setting of this particular crime, surrounded by children's games and homemade preserves, seemed to give even him pause. The inspector's first action was to clear the tent and establish a perimeter around the scene, though this proved challenging given that half the village had already crowded around to gawk. The other half, he soon learned, claimed to have been elsewhere entirely when the murder occurred, though their accounts of their whereabouts proved to be remarkably vague and contradictory. Dr. Haydock, the local physician who had been manning the bottle stall, confirmed what was obvious to anyone with eyes. Colonel Whitmore was quite dead, and had been for at least an hour, possibly more. The letter opener, which Dr. Haydock identified as an expensive piece with an ivory handle and silver blade, had been driven into the colonel's back with considerable force, penetrating between the ribs and puncturing the heart. Professional. Job, the doctor muttered to Inspector Craddock as they stood over the body. Whoever did this knew exactly where to strike. The colonel had been dressed in his usual summer attire, cream-colored linen trousers, a blue blazer with brass buttons, and a regimental tie that spoke of past glories in places with names like Malaya and Burma. He had been, by all accounts, a man who insisted on maintaining certain standards even in retirement. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, his hair precisely parted and held in place with pomade, and his moustache trimmed with military precision. What struck Inspector Craddock as particularly odd was the position of the body. The colonel lay face down, but his arms were splayed in a way that suggested he had been turning around when the blow was struck. More curious still, his right hand was clenched around something. 3 raffle tickets, numbers 47, 91, and 103, while dozens more were scattered around him, as if someone had been frantically searching through them. The murder weapon itself told its own story. The letter opener was familiar to several villagers as belonging to Mrs. Gladys Hartwell, the formidable president of the Women's Institute and organizer of the jam competition. She had donated it, along with several other household items, to the raffle earlier that week. It had been sitting in plain view on the prize table for anyone to see and to take. Mrs. Hartwell, when informed that her letter opener had become a murder weapon, reacted with the sort of outrage typically reserved for poorly risen Yorkshire puddings or delayed trains. She was a woman in her early 60s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her features, and she had the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Preposterous, she declared, her voice carrying across the green with the authority of a drill sergeant. That letter opener has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather brought it back from India. To think that someone would use it for such a purpose, it's beyond comprehension. Inspector Craddock made careful notes as Mrs. Hartwell recounted how she had personally delivered the donated items to the raffle tent on Wednesday morning, how she had arranged them just so on the table, and how she had specifically instructed young Simon Fletcher, who was helping with the setup, to ensure that nothing was disturbed before the fete began. The inspector found young Simon behind the tombola, looking rather green around the gills and clutching a cup of tea that someone had pressed into his hands. Simon was 17, all elbows and Adam's apple, with the sort of earnest face that suggested he had never told a lie in his life. His account of Wednesday morning was detailed and precise. He had arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, had helped Mrs. Hartwell arrange the prizes, had covered the table with a white cloth, and had locked the tent securely before leaving. Did anyone else have access to the tent between Wednesday and today? Inspector Craddock asked. Simon's brow furrowed with concentration. Well, there was Mrs. Pemberton, of course. She has a key because she's in charge of decorations, and Mr. Clement needed to store some carousel parts in there Thursday night because of the rain. Oh, and Dr. Haydock stopped by Friday morning to add a bottle of his homemade elderberry wine to the prizes. The inspector made more notes. Access to the murder weapon, it seemed, was hardly restricted. The tent itself revealed frustratingly few clues. The grass floor showed signs of considerable foot traffic, making it impossible to distinguish any particular set of prints. The prize table had been disturbed, items knocked over and moved around. But whether this had happened during the murder or afterward was unclear. Most puzzling of all was a small pile of lavender sachets that had been carefully arranged in a neat circle near the tent's rear entrance, as if someone had been playing a peculiar game or performing some sort of ritual. Inspector Craddock was examining these sachets when he became aware of a presence behind him. He turned to find an elderly woman watching him with bright, intelligent eyes. She was small and neat, with silver hair tucked under a straw hat and a floral dress that suggested she might have been on her way to a garden party rather than a crime scene. "Miss Marple," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Jane Marple. I live in the cottage by the pond, Mead. Terrible business, this." The inspector had heard of Miss Marple, of course. Her reputation for solving puzzles had reached even the police stations of Much Benham, though he had never had occasion to meet her before. She looked, he thought, exactly like what one might expect of a village spinster. Harmless, elderly, and probably more concerned with her knitting than with murder. He was, as many before him had been, quite wrong. "You knew the Colonel, I suppose?" Inspector Craddock asked, more out of politeness than any real expectation of useful information. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Oh, yes, quite well. He moved to the village about 5 years ago, after his retirement from the army. Bought Meldrum. House, the big Victorian place on the hill. Kept very much to himself at first, though he had begun to come out of his shell recently. He seemed particularly interested in local history. Any enemies that you know of? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with something that might have been amusement. Inspector, I've lived in St. Mary Mead for over 70 years. In a village this size, everyone is someone's enemy at some point or another. The question isn't whether the colonel had enemies, but which of them was sufficiently motivated to do something about it. The inspector found himself intrigued, despite his better judgment. And what do you think, Miss Marple? Who might have wanted the colonel dead? She was quiet for a moment, gazing around the tent with those sharp eyes of hers. Well, there was the matter of the planning committee, of course, and then there was his research into the Pemberton family tree. That caused quite a stir. But most interesting of all, I think, was his recent correspondence with a solicitor in London about mineral rights. Inspector Craddock blinked. None of these things had come up in his preliminary interviews. Mineral rights? Oh, yes. Colonel Whitmore had discovered something rather interesting about the land that the village green sits on, something to do with old maps and surveys. He had been making quite a nuisance of himself at the parish council meetings, asking awkward questions about who actually owns what. Miss Marple paused to adjust her hat. People can become very protective indeed when it comes to property, don't you think? Before the inspector could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion outside the tent. Mrs. Hartwell's voice rose above the murmur of the crowd. I don't care what anyone says. That man was a troublemaker from the day he arrived, always poking his nose into things that didn't concern him. Inspector Craddock exchanged glances with Miss Marple. Perhaps we should hear what Mrs. Hartwell has to say. They found Mrs. Hartwell holding court near the jam competition table, surrounded by a cluster of village women who hung on her every word like disciples receiving wisdom from a prophet. She had clearly worked herself into a state of righteous indignation, her face flushed, and her voice carrying the sort of authority that suggested she was accustomed to being listened to. The man was obsessed with the past, she was saying. Always. Digging through old records, asking impertinent questions. Only last month he had the audacity to suggest that the Women's Institute might not have the right to hold our meetings in the church hall. Can you imagine? Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, still pale from her earlier shock, nodded vigorously. He questioned everything, even suggested that the rectory garden might not belong to the church at all, but to some ancient trust that no one had heard of. What sort of questions was he asking? Inspector Craddock interjected, notepad at the ready. Mrs. Hartwell fixed him with a look that could have curdled milk. The sort that weren't his business to ask, Inspector. The colonel seemed to think that just because he had served in India and Burma, he was qualified to reorganize our entire village. He spent months at the county records office, going through dusty old documents that should have been left well alone. Miss Marple, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. I believe he found something rather specific, didn't he, Mrs. Hartwell? Something about the original charter of the village green. The president of the Women's Institute stiffened. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. Oh, but I think you do. The colonel mentioned it to me just last Tuesday when I met him at the post office. He seemed quite excited about his discovery. Something about the green being designated for a very particular purpose when it was originally donated to the village in 1847. Inspector Craddock looked from one woman to the other, sensing undercurrents he didn't quite understand. What purpose would that be? Miss Marple smiled gently. Well, according to the colonel's research, the land was donated specifically for the establishment of a market, a proper market, with permanent stalls and regular trading. The donor, one, Jeremiah Pemberton, Mrs. Pemberton's great-great-grandfather, I believe, had very specific ideas about how the land should be used. Mrs. Pemberton's already pale face went completely white. That's That's impossible. The green has always been for community use. Always. Yes, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, but the question is whether the community has been using it as Jeremiah Pemberton intended. And if not, whether his heirs might have a claim to reclaim the land. The implications hung in the air like smoke from the sausage stand. Inspector Craddock made rapid calculations in his head. The village green occupied nearly 3 acres of prime land in the heart of St. Mary Mead. If it were to be sold for development, it would be worth a considerable fortune. And if the Pemberton family had a legal claim to it. "This is all ancient history," Mrs. Hartwell said firmly. "No court would uphold such a claim after all these years." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "Perhaps not. But the Colonel seemed quite confident that he had found some very interesting documents, modern surveys, boundary markers that had been moved, that sort of thing. He was planning to present his findings to the parish council next month. Inspector Craddock made a mental note to search the Colonel's house for these documents. But first, he needed to understand more about the relationships between the players in this drama. The afternoon was growing late, and the fete, such as it was with a murder investigation in progress, was winding down. The carousel had been silent. For hours its painted horses frozen in their eternal gallop. The various stalls were being packed away by their operators, though Inspector Craddock had instructed everyone to remain available for questioning. He found Dr. Haydock supervising the removal of the Colonel's body, a process that required delicate maneuvering given the confined space of the tent and the need to preserve the crime scene. The doctor, a man in his 50s with the sort of practical demeanor that came from decades of dealing with the messier aspects of human existence, had little to add to his initial assessment. Death would have been nearly instantaneous, he told the inspector. The blade penetrated between the 4th and 5th ribs, puncturing the right ventricle. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Medical knowledge, Dr. Haydock considered this, possibly, or military training. The Colonel himself would have known how to kill a man efficiently. It's the sort of thing they teach officers, in places like Burma. But then so would anyone who had spent time butchering animals, or even someone who had read the right books. Inspector Craddock found this frustratingly unhelpful. In his experience, murders were usually committed by people with obvious motives using whatever weapon came to hand. The level of precision suggested by Dr. Haydock implied either premeditation or considerable luck. As the body was loaded into the ambulance, Inspector Craddock noticed Miss Marple crouched beside the fortune-teller's booth, examining something on the ground with intense concentration. He wandered over to see what had caught her attention. Find something interesting. She looked up with that bright, intelligent expression he was beginning to recognize. Perhaps. Look at this. She pointed to a small depression in the grass, barely visible unless one was looking for it. Someone stood here for quite some time, I think, long enough to leave a mark even in this dry weather. The inspector knelt beside her. The depression was indeed there, roughly the size and shape of a woman's shoe heel. It was positioned at an angle that would have given whoever stood there a clear view through the tent's rear entrance, the same entrance where the pile of lavender sachets had been so carefully arranged. Someone was watching, Miss Marple said quietly. But watching what? The Colonel, or watching for someone else? Inspector Craddock was beginning to appreciate the old woman's eye for detail. What do you make of those sachets? The ones arranged in a circle. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving between the tent and the fortune-teller's booth. I think they were a signal of some sort, or perhaps a distraction, something to draw attention away from what was really happening. Any idea who might have arranged them? Oh yes, Miss Marple said with certainty. That surprised the inspector. Mrs. Pemberton made them. I recognize her needlework. She has a very distinctive way of finishing the corners. But the question is whether she arranged them there herself, or whether someone else moved them after taking them from her stall. Inspector Craddock looked around the green, trying to piece together the geography of the crime. Mrs. Pemberton's handicrafts stall was positioned near the duck pond, perhaps 30 yards from the raffle tent. The fortune-teller's booth, operated by a theatrical woman from Much Benham, who called herself Madame Zelda, was directly behind the raffle tent, separated by no more than 10 feet of grass. The positioning suddenly struck him as significant. Someone standing at Madame Zelda's booth would have had a clear view of anyone entering or leaving the raffle tent through its rear entrance. They would also have been concealed from the view of most of the fete-goers, who were concentrated around the main attractions near the church. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I think there's something you should know about Mrs. Pemberton's financial situation." He looked at her sharply. "What sort of something?" "Well, it's just village gossip, you understand. But there have been rumors. The vicar's stipend is hardly generous, and Mrs. Pemberton has been creative in her efforts to supplement their income. The handicrafts, the jam-making, the occasional bit of dressmaking for the ladies in the village. But lately people have been wondering if she might have been involved in something rather more lucrative." "Such as?" Miss Marple glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Antiques, Inspector. There have been several valuable pieces that have gone missing from houses around the village over the past year. Nothing dramatic enough to warrant calling in the police, you understand. The sort of things that people assume they've simply misplaced. A silver letter opener here, a piece of Georgian crystal there, but Mrs. Pemberton has been seen at the antique shops in Much Benham rather frequently lately." Inspector Craddock felt the familiar tingle that came when scattered pieces of a puzzle began to form a pattern. "You think she's been stealing?" "I think she's been desperate. And desperate people do desperate things." Miss Marple paused. "The question is whether the Colonel had discovered what she was up to." The inspector made more notes, his mind racing. If Mrs. Pemberton had been stealing antiques and the Colonel had threatened to expose her, that would certainly provide a motive for murder. But it didn't explain the precision of the killing, or the strange arrangement of the lavender sachets, or the scattered raffle tickets clutched in the Colonel's hand. As if reading his thoughts, Miss Marple said, "I think we need to pay more attention to those raffle tickets, Inspector. Numbers 47, 91, and 103. They might be more significant than they appear." "How so?" "Well, I've been thinking about the timing of the murder. It happened during the busiest part of the afternoon, when everyone was focused on the various competitions and activities. But the raffle drawing wasn't scheduled until 5 o'clock, nearly 2 hours after the Colonel was killed. So why was he holding raffle tickets at all? Inspector Craddock had to admit he hadn't considered this. Perhaps he was just looking through them. Perhaps. But consider this. What if the tickets weren't random? What if they corresponded to something else entirely? Miss Marple's eyes held that twinkle again. "Numbers can mean many things, Inspector. House numbers, dates, measurements." Before he could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of a middle-aged man in a worn tweed jacket who introduced himself as Mr. Clement, the carousel operator. He had the weathered look of someone who spent his life traveling from fair to fair, and his hands bore the permanent stains of machine oil and paint. "Terrible business, this," he said, shaking his head. "I've been running fairground equipment for 20 years, and I've never had anything like this happen at one of my events." Inspector Craddock questioned him about his movements during the afternoon, but Mr. Clement's account was frustratingly vague. He had been operating the carousel almost continuously since the fete began, taking only brief breaks to refill the music box or help children on and off the horses. He claimed to have noticed nothing unusual until Mrs. Pemberton's scream. "Did you know Colonel Whitmore?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Clement's expression shifted slightly. "We'd met, yes. He came by when I was setting up on Thursday, asking questions about the carousel. Seemed particularly interested in its history." "What sort of questions?" "Oh, Where? I'd acquired it, how old it was, that sort of thing. I told him it had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built it himself back in 1897. The Colonel seemed very interested in that date for some reason. Miss Marple exchanged glances with Inspector Craddock. Another connection to the past, another thread in the increasingly complex web surrounding the Colonel's research. Did he say why the date was significant? Inspector Craddock asked. Mr. Clement shrugged. Something about land grants and old maps. To be honest, Inspector, I didn't pay much attention. People are always asking about the history of the carousel. It's a talking point, you know. Helps draw customers. As Mr. Clement wandered off to secure his equipment, Inspector Craddock found himself increasingly puzzled by the case. Every conversation seemed to reveal new complications, new connections to the Colonel's research into local history. What had started as a straightforward murder was beginning to feel like an archaeological excavation, with each layer revealing new mysteries. Miss Marple seemed to be following a similar line of thought. "Inspector," she said, "I think we need to visit the Colonel's house. If he really had discovered something significant about the village's history, the evidence will be there." Meldrum House sat on a rise overlooking the village, a solid Victorian structure of red brick and bay windows that spoke of middle-class prosperity and conventional respectability. The Colonel had maintained it in pristine condition, with a neat garden, freshly painted window frames, and a front door that gleamed with black enamel and brass fittings. Inspector Craddock had obtained the necessary warrant, and they entered, through the front door using keys found in the Colonel's pocket. The interior was exactly what one might expect of a retired military officer. Dark wooden furniture, regimental photographs on the walls, and everything arranged with military precision. But it was the Colonel's study that proved most revealing. One wall was covered with maps of the village and surrounding countryside, some dating back to the 18th century. Pins and colored threads connected various points, creating a complex web that suggested months of careful research. On the desk, arranged in neat piles, were photocopied documents from county archives, old survey reports and correspondence with solicitors and historical societies. Miss Marple picked up a leather-bound notebook and began reading the Colonel's careful handwriting. "Extraordinary," she murmured. "Inspector, you need to see this." The notebook contained the Colonel's research notes, written in the precise style of someone accustomed to military reports. The picture that emerged was one of systematic deception going back over a century. According to the Colonel's findings, the original charter for the village green had indeed specified that the land was to be used for a market, but more than that, Jeremiah Pemberton had included specific clauses about mineral rights and development restrictions that had been conveniently ignored by subsequent generations. The most damning discovery was a series of boundary surveys from the 1920s that showed the green's boundaries had been systematically altered over the decades. Land that should have reverted to the Pemberton family had instead been absorbed into other properties, including the rectory garden where Mrs. Pemberton now grew her prize-winning vegetables. "If this is accurate," Inspector Craddock said, studying a particularly detailed map, "then half the properties in the village centre are sitting on land that legally belongs to the Pemberton Family Trust." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "And that would make Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton a very wealthy woman indeed, if she could prove her claim." But there was more. The Colonel's correspondence revealed that he had been in contact with developers from London who were interested in purchasing the green for a shopping centre development. The sums mentioned were staggering, enough to transform the economic future of anyone with a legitimate claim to the land. In a folder marked "Confidential," they found copies of letters the Colonel had sent to various village residents, informing them that their property rights might be in question. Mrs. Hartwell had received one as had Dr. Haydock, Mr. Clement, and several others. He was systematically threatening the entire power structure of the village, Inspector Craddock observed. More than that, Miss Marple said quietly. He was threatening their livelihoods, their homes, their entire way of life. That's a very powerful motive for murder. As they continued to examine the documents, a clearer picture began to emerge. The colonel hadn't been content simply to research the village's history. He had been building a legal case that would have upended everything. His correspondence with London solicitors revealed that he had been preparing to file formal challenges to property deeds, to demand the return of lands illegally absorbed, and to claim compensation for decades of unauthorized use. But perhaps most significant was a letter dated just 3 days before his death, addressed to Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, and marked hand-delivered. In it, the colonel laid out his findings in detail and made an extraordinary proposal. He would share his evidence with her, allowing her to claim her rightful inheritance in exchange for a partnership in developing the land. He was trying to make her his ally, Miss Marple said. But why? Inspector Craddock studied the letter more carefully. Look at the postscript. He mentions recent discoveries that made his proposal more urgent, something about evidence that might not remain available much longer. They searched the house more thoroughly, looking for these additional discoveries, but found nothing obvious. However, in the colonel's bedroom, Miss Marple discovered something that made her catch her breath. Hidden behind a framed photograph of the colonel's old regiment was a small wall safe, its door standing open. Inside were several items that seemed incongruous with the rest of the house's military orderliness. A woman's silk scarf, a piece of Georgian crystal, a silver cigarette case, and most intriguingly, the colonel's army service revolver, its barrel recently cleaned. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I think the colonel may have been blackmailing Mrs. Pemberton." The scarf was clearly expensive, made of silk with a pattern of blue roses that Miss Marple recognized as coming from an exclusive shop in London. The crystal piece was a paperweight in the shape of a swan, the sort of thing that might sit on a lady's dressing table. The cigarette case bore the initials G.H., which could very well stand for Gladys Hartwell. "Stolen goods," Inspector Craddock said grimly. He discovered her little side business and decided to use it as leverage. Miss Marple was examining the revolver with the sort of careful attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. "This has been fired recently, Inspector. You can smell the cordite, and the barrel has been cleaned, but not thoroughly enough to hide all traces." The implications were staggering. If the colonel had been blackmailing Mrs. Pemberton over her theft activities, threatening to expose her unless she cooperated with his land development scheme, then her motive for murder was even stronger than they had initially suspected. But the presence of the revolver suggested something else, that the colonel might have been prepared to use force to ensure her cooperation. Had Mrs. Pemberton killed him in self-defense? Or had someone else discovered the colonel's blackmail scheme and decided to put a stop to it? As they prepared to leave Meldrum House, Miss Marple made one final discovery. In the colonel's desk drawer, underneath a pile of insurance documents, was a small appointment diary. The entries for the week of the murder made for fascinating reading. Monday, meeting with London solicitors, final preparations. Tuesday, delivered proposal to DP awaiting response. Wednesday, visited archive again, confirmed suspicions about boundary markers. Thursday, observed unusual activity, carousel set up more elaborate than necessary. Friday, final, preparations for revelation, everything depends on tomorrow. And then for Saturday, the day of the fete and the colonel's death, a single entry, 3 p.m., resolution. He was planning to confront someone at 3 o'clock, Inspector Craddock said. The murder happened sometime between 2:30 and 3:30, according to Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple was studying the Thursday entry with particular interest. "Inspector, what do you suppose he meant about the carousel setup being more elaborate than necessary?" They drove back to the village green in thoughtful silence, each lost in their own interpretation of what they had discovered. The fete was long over now, the stalls packed away, and the bunting taken down. Only the carousel remained, its painted horses casting long shadows in the evening light. Mr. Clement was loading the last of his equipment into a large truck when they approached. He looked up with the wary expression of someone who had been expecting this visit. "Finished for the day?" Inspector Craddock asked pleasantly. "Just about. It'll take me most of tomorrow to pack everything properly, but the main bits are secure." Mr. Clement wiped his hands on a rag. Terrible shame about the colonel. He seemed like a decent enough fellow. Miss Marple was walking slowly around the carousel, examining it with the same careful attention she had given to everything else. "It really is a beautiful piece of work," she said. "Your grandfather was clearly a master craftsman." Mr. Clement's expression softened. "Aye, he was that. Spent 3 years building it, carved every horse by hand. It's been my life's work, keeping it running." "The colonel was very interested in its history, you said." "That's right, kept asking about when it was built, where it had been stored over the years, that sort of thing." Mr. Clement paused in his packing. Funny thing, though, he seemed particularly interested in the base mechanism, kept walking around underneath it, looking at the support structure. Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged glances. "Did he find anything unusual?" Mr. Clement's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. "Not that I noticed, though he did ask a lot of questions about the storage shed where we keep it during the winter months." "And where would that be?" "Old barn on Pendleton's farm, about 2 miles outside the village. Been using it for years. The farmer doesn't charge much because it's not suitable for livestock anymore." Miss Marple was now crouched down, peering underneath the carousel's central platform. "Mr. Clement," she said quietly, "I think you should call Inspector Craddock over here." The inspector joined her beneath the carousel, using his flashlight to illuminate what Miss Marple had discovered. Built into the wooden support structure, camouflaged by decades of paint and repair work, was a hidden compartment. And inside that compartment were several packages wrapped in oilcloth. Mr. Clement's protestations of innocence were somewhat undermined by his immediate attempt to flee, an effort that was frustrated by Inspector Craddock's quick reflexes and the presence of several constables who had arrived as backup. The packages, when unwrapped, revealed a treasure trove of stolen antiques dating back several years, far more than could be accounted for by Mrs. Pemberton's alleged activities. "Quite an operation," Inspector Craddock observed as they examined the hall by lamplight. "Using the carousel as a mobile storage facility, moving stolen goods from village to village under everyone's noses." Mr. Clement, now in handcuffs and considerably less jovial than he had been earlier, admitted to running the theft ring, but vehemently denied murdering the colonel. "I never touched him," he insisted. "Yes, he'd figured out what I was doing, but we'd come to an arrangement." "What sort of arrangement?" "He wanted a cut of the profits in exchange for keeping quiet. Said he needed funding for his legal battle." "Over the village green. We were supposed to meet this afternoon to work out the details." Miss Marple, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "At 3 o'clock?" Mr. Clement nodded miserably. "He said to meet him in the raffle tent at 3. Said it would be the perfect place to conduct private business, with all the noise and confusion of the fete going on around us." Inspector Craddock made rapid notes. "So you went to the tent at 3 o'clock. I got there a few minutes early, maybe 2:45, but the colonel was already dead when I arrived. Scared the life out of me, I can tell you. I was just trying to figure out what to do when I heard Mrs. Pemberton coming, so I slipped out the back way." "Did you see anyone else near the tent?" Mr. Clement's brow furrowed with concentration. "There was someone by that fortune-teller's booth. A woman, I think." though I couldn't see her clearly. She seemed to be arranging something on the ground, flowers or herbs or something. The lavender sachets, Miss Marple thought, but arranged by whom and why? As Mr. Clement was led away to the police car, Inspector Craddock found himself with more questions than answers. The carousel operator had certainly had motive to kill the colonel. Blackmail victims often turn on their tormentors. But his story about finding the body had the ring of truth to it, and it still didn't explain the precision of the killing, or the mysterious woman arranging lavender sachets. Miss Marple stood in the gathering dusk, her sharp eyes moving between the raffle tent and the fortune-teller's booth. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we need to have another conversation with Mrs. Pemberton. But first, there's something I'd like to check at the church." The parish church of St. Mary Mead was one of those ancient Norman structures that seemed to have grown from the very soil of England, its stone walls weathered by centuries of rain and wind. The building was locked for the evening, but Miss Marple produced a key from her handbag with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had been helping with church affairs for decades. Inside, the air was cool and heavy, with the scent of old wood and candle wax. Miss Marple led the way to a small office behind the altar, where parish records were kept in filing cabinets that looked as ancient as the church itself. "What exactly are we looking for?" Inspector Craddock asked, as Miss Marple began pulling out ledgers and record books. Birth certificates, marriage records, anything that might tell us more about the Pemberton family history. She opened a leather-bound volume dated 1847. If Colonel Whitmore's research was correct, then Dorothy Pemberton stands to inherit a considerable fortune. But inheritance law can be complicated, especially when it involves trusts and entailments that go back over a century. They spent the next hour poring over handwritten records, tracing the Pemberton family line through marriages, deaths, and property transfers. What emerged was a complex picture of a family that had once been wealthy, but had gradually lost their holdings through a combination of poor investments, gambling debts, and simple mismanagement. Dorothy Pemberton, N.A. Williams, had married into the family 30 years ago when she wed the current vicar, the Reverend Charles Pemberton. Charles was indeed a direct descendant of Jeremiah Pemberton, the original donor of the village green, but his branch of the family had been considered the poor relations for generations. "Look at this," Miss Marple said, pointing to an entry from 1923. Charles's father, Robert Pemberton, sold his claim to the family trust to his cousin Frederick for £200. It says here that he was in debt and needed the money urgently. Inspector Craddock studied the document. So Charles, and by extension his wife Dorothy, might not have any legal claim to the trust after all. That's what it appears to suggest. But look at the signature. Miss Marple held the document up to the lamp. "It's been altered. See how the ink is slightly different here, where it says, 'sold his claim'? I suspect the original document said something quite different." The inspector leaned closer. Now that Miss Marple had pointed it out, the alteration was obvious. Someone had carefully changed the wording of the document, transforming what might have been a mortgage or temporary loan into an outright sale. Frederick Pemberton was covering his tracks, Miss Marple concluded. He wanted to ensure that his branch of the family maintained control of the trust, so he falsified the records to show that Robert had sold his rights rather than simply borrowing against them. But who would know about this alteration? Miss Marple was already reaching for another volume. Someone with access to parish records, someone who had reason to research the family history recently. She found what she was looking for in a visitor's log from 6 months earlier. Here we are. Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, researching family genealogy for the Village Historical Society. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Dorothy Pemberton had discovered the alteration in the family records, realized that her husband might have a legitimate claim to the trust after all, and then found herself in the extraordinary position of learning that Colonel Whitmore's research could make her wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. But there was still the matter of the murder itself, and the evidence that suggested Mrs. Pemberton might have been stealing from her neighbours to supplement the vicar's meagre income. They walked back to the rectory, through the quiet village streets, past cottages where lights glowed warmly behind. Curtained windows and the scent of evening meals drifted on the air. It was the sort of scene that belonged on a chocolate box, all pastoral innocence and timeless tranquility. Yet beneath that surface, Miss Marple reflected, lay currents of greed, desperation, and murderous intent. The rectory was a modest Georgian house, set behind a garden that was famous throughout the county for its roses and vegetables. Mrs. Pemberton answered the door herself, still wearing the same dress she had worn to the fete, but looking considerably more composed than she had earlier in the day. "Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock, I was wondering when you might call." She ushered them into a sitting room that spoke of genteel poverty, good furniture that had seen better days, faded curtains that had been carefully mended, and the sort of careful arrangements that suggested every penny was counted twice. "We're sorry to disturb you so late," Inspector Craddock began, "but we have some questions about your movements this afternoon and about your knowledge of your family's history." Mrs. Pemberton settled into a chair by the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap, with the sort of calm that could mean either innocence or very carefully controlled guilt. "Of course, Inspector, though I'm not sure how much help I can be." Miss Marple studied the woman's face as Inspector Craddock began his questioning. Dorothy Pemberton was in her late 50s, with greying hair and the sort of lined face that spoke of years of worry and careful budgeting. She had the bearing of someone who had once expected better from life, but had learned to make the best of disappointment. "Mrs. Pemberton," the inspector said, "can you tell us about your conversation with Colonel Whitmore earlier this week? We understand he had made you a proposal regarding your family's potential claim to the village green." For just a moment, Mrs. Pemberton's composure slipped. "I'm not sure what you mean, Inspector." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Pemberton, we've seen the Colonel's letter to you. We know about the research he had done into your family's history, and about the alterations to the parish records that your husband's grandfather made." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Mrs. Pemberton spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Charles doesn't know about the records, I mean, or about the Colonel's proposal. I never told him." "Why not?" "Because—" She struggled with the words. "Because for 30 years I've watched him pour his heart into this parish, working for a stipend that barely keeps us fed, while other people in the village live in comfort that his own family helped provide. The idea that we might finally have some security, some dignity." She wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. "I couldn't bear to raise his hopes only to have them dashed again." Inspector Craddock made careful notes. "So, you were planning to accept the Colonel's proposal?" "I was considering it. He wanted to form a partnership. He would provide the legal expertise and funding for the court case, and I would provide the family connection. If we succeeded, we would split any profits from developing the land." "That could have amounted to a considerable sum." Mrs. Pemberton nodded. "Enough to ensure that Charles could retire with dignity, that we could finally travel, see something of the world beyond St. Mary Mead." Her voice hardened slightly. "Was that so wrong, Inspector? To want something better after a lifetime of scrimp and saving?" Miss Marple spoke gently. "Mrs. Pemberton, we need to ask you about the other matter, about the missing items from various houses in the village." The change in Mrs. Pemberton's expression was immediate and dramatic. The careful composure crumbled, replaced by a look of trapped desperation. I don't know what you mean." I think you do. The silver cigarette case we found in the Colonel's safe has Mrs. Hartwell's initials on it. The crystal paperweight matches the description of one that went missing from Dr. Haydock's surgery 6 months ago. And the silk scarf— Miss Marple paused. That's yours, isn't it? The one you wore to the Christmas pageant last year? Mrs. Pemberton's hands were shaking now. How did he get my scarf? I suspect he took it from you as insurance, to ensure your cooperation with his proposal, just as he took items that you had borrowed from other houses. The word borrowed hung in the air with all the euphemistic weight that guilt could give it. Mrs. Pemberton buried her face in her hands. It started so small, she whispered. Just the occasional item that I knew wouldn't be missed immediately. A piece of silver here, a bit of china there. I sold them at shops in Much Benham, far enough away that no one would recognize them. The money went toward Charles's medical bills. He's been having trouble with his heart, though he doesn't want anyone to know. But the Colonel found out. He was too thorough, too careful in his research. He started asking questions about antiques that had been sold in the area, and somehow he connected me to them. When I went to meet him on Tuesday to discuss his proposal about the trust, he confronted me with evidence of what I'd been doing. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. What sort of evidence? Receipts from the antique dealers, photographs he had taken of items in the shops that he recognized from village houses. He said he had been building a case, documenting everything. Mrs. Pemberton's voice was barely audible. He said he would keep quiet about it if I agreed to his partnership. But if I refused, he would expose you. She nodded miserably. It would have destroyed Charles. The scandal, the shame, he would never have survived it. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock exchanged glances. They were getting closer to the truth, but there were still pieces missing from the puzzle. Mrs. Pemberton, Miss Marple said carefully, can you tell us exactly where you were between 2:30 and 3:30 this afternoon? I was at my handicraft stall for most of that time, helping customers and judging the needlework competition. But— she hesitated. But I did leave for a few minutes around 3 o'clock. Where did you go? To the fortune-teller's booth. Madame Zelda had asked me earlier if I could bring her some of my lavender sachets. She said they would help create the right atmosphere for her readings, so I took a handful over to her. Inspector Craddock made a note. Did you see anyone near the raffle tent when you were there? I'm not sure. There was a lot of activity, people coming and going. But now that you mention it, I did notice that the tent flap was open, which was unusual. Mrs. Hartwell had been very specific that it should remain closed until the drawing at 5 o'clock. Miss Marple was studying Mrs. Pemberton with that penetrating gaze of hers. Mrs. Pemberton, when you arranged the lavender sachets at Madame Zelda's booth, did you notice anything unusual? Anyone watching the tent, perhaps? Well, there was someone of a figure in dark clothing standing behind the tent. I couldn't see who it was clearly, but they seemed to be looking through the rear entrance. I thought it was odd. But with everything else going on, could you tell if it was a man or a woman? Mrs. Pemberton closed her eyes, trying to remember. I think it was a woman, the way she stood, the shape of her silhouette. But she was too far away for me to be certain. As they prepared to leave the rectory, Inspector Craddock felt that they were tantalizingly close to solving the case, yet still missing some crucial element. They had established that multiple people had motives for killing the Colonel. Mr. Clement to protect his theft operation, Mrs. Pemberton to prevent exposure of her own stealing and to protect her potential inheritance claim, and presumably others who were threatened by the Colonel's research into property rights. But the precision of the killing still troubled him. The letter opener had been driven into exactly the right spot, with exactly the right force. It suggested either medical knowledge, military training, or considerable luck. Miss Marple seemed to be following a similar train of thought as they walked back toward the village green. "Inspector," she said, "I think there's one more person we need to speak with. Someone who had medical knowledge, access to the murder weapon, and a very strong motive to prevent the Colonel's research from coming to light. Dr. Haydock?" "Dr. Haydock." Miss Marple nodded grimly. "If the Colonel's findings were correct, then the doctor's surgery, which he owns outright, sits on land that legally belongs to the Pemberton Trust. That would make his life's work, his investment in the property, his plans for retirement all worthless. They found Dr. Haydock at his surgery, a converted Victorian house on the outskirts of the village centre. He was working late, catching up on paperwork, and seemed unsurprised to see them. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I've been expecting you." He gestured for them to sit in the comfortable chairs usually reserved for patients. "I assume you want to discuss my whereabouts this afternoon and my relationship with the late Colonel." Dr. Haydock was a man in his early 60s, with the sort of weathered competence that came from decades of dealing with the full spectrum of human ailments. He had served the village faithfully for over 30 years, delivering babies, tending the sick, and providing comfort to the dying. The idea that such a man might be a murderer seemed almost absurd. "We understand the Colonel's research might have had implications for your property," Inspector Craddock began carefully. Dr. Haydock nodded wearily. "More than implications, Inspector. If his findings were correct, and I have no reason to doubt, they were then this surgery, which I purchased 25 years ago and have spent a fortune renovating, sits on land that was illegally separated from the village green in 1923. The Pemberton Trust would have every right to reclaim it." That must have been quite a shock. Devastating would be a better word. "I'm 62 years old, Inspector. I had planned to retire in 3 years and sell this practice to fund my retirement. If the property reverts to the trust, I lose everything I've worked for." Miss Marple leaned forward. "When did you first learn about the Colonel's research?" "He came to see me about 2 months ago. Very civilized about it, I must say. Laid out his findings, showed me copies of the documents he had found. He said he wanted to give me advance warning before he took the matter to court." "Did he make you any sort of proposal?" Dr. Haydock's expression darkened slightly. "Oh, yes. He suggested that I might want to contribute to his legal fund in exchange for his promise to ensure that any property transfers were handled reasonably. A sort of protection fee, you might say." "Blackmail?" "Elegant blackmail, but blackmail nonetheless." The doctor stood and walked to the window overlooking his garden. "He had similar conversations with others in the village, I believe. Mrs. Hartwell, the Fletchers, anyone whose property might be affected by his research." Inspector Craddock made notes. Another person with motive, another person who might have felt desperate enough to resort to murder. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said, "can you account for your movements between 2:30 and 3:30? "This afternoon. I was here in the surgery seeing patients. Mrs. Crawford came in at 2:15 with her arthritis, and young Tommy Fletcher arrived at 3:20 with a cut on his hand from helping dismantle one of the stalls. In between I was alone catching up on medical records. So you have no alibi for the crucial time period?" Dr. Haydock turned from the window with a rueful smile. "I'm afraid not, Inspector. Rather careless of me, wasn't it?" Miss Marple was studying the doctor with that penetrating gaze of hers. "Dr. Haydock, you examined the Colonel's body. You would have known exactly where to strike to ensure a quick death. Any competent physician would know that, just as any former military officer would know it, or anyone who had spent time butchering animals, or even someone who had read a decent medical textbook." The doctor's tone was matter-of-fact. "I'm afraid anatomical knowledge is not as rare as you might suppose. But the precision of the wound suggests someone with considerable skill. Or considerable luck." Dr. Haydock returned to his chair. Inspector, I won't pretend that I wasn't tempted. The Colonel was systematically destroying the lives and livelihoods of people I had known and cared for over 3 decades. He was using his research as a weapon, threatening everything we had built in this village. But I didn't kill him. Then, who did? Dr. Haydock was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of him. I think, Inspector, that you're asking the wrong question. What do you mean? You're asking who killed the Colonel, but perhaps you should be asking why the killer chose that particular method, that particular time and place. The doctor's eyes held a glint that reminded Miss Marple of her own moments of insight. The letter opener wasn't chosen at random, neither was the timing or the location in the raffle tent. Miss Marple sat up straighter. You think the murder was staged? To look like something else? I think the murder was designed to send a message, to the Colonel even though he was dead, to the village, to someone specific. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. Consider the symbolism, Miss Marple. The murder weapon was donated to the raffle, a gesture of community spirit corrupted into an instrument of death. The location was a tent dedicated to chance and luck, where people paid money for the hope of winning prizes they probably didn't need. Inspector Craddock was becoming frustrated. With the increasingly philosophical turn the conversation was taking. Dr. Haydock, if you have specific knowledge about who committed this crime, I need you to share it. I don't have knowledge, Inspector. I have suspicions, theories, educated guesses based on 30 years of observing human nature in all its forms. The doctor paused. But I will say this. I think you'll find that the Colonel's death was not just about money or property rights. It was about something much more fundamental, such as justice, or at least someone's idea of justice. As they left the surgery, Miss Marple found herself turning Dr. Haydock's words over in her mind. Justice? What sort of justice might require murder? And who in the village might see themselves as an instrument of that justice? The evening was drawing in now, and the village was settling into its familiar rhythms. Lights came on in cottage windows, the smell of cooking filled the air, and the sound of the BBC News drifted from radios in sitting rooms. It was the sort of peaceful scene that made it difficult to believe that murder had been committed just hours earlier. But as they walked past the darkened stalls of the abandoned fete, Miss Marple noticed something that made her stop suddenly. "Inspector," she said quietly, "look at the raffle tent." The tent still stood where it had been erected that morning, its striped canvas now ghostly in the gathering darkness. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was not the tent itself, but the way the evening breeze was making the fabric move. The rear entrance, which had been carefully closed when they examined the scene earlier, was now flapping open. They approached the tent carefully, Inspector Craddock's flashlight cutting through the darkness. Inside, the prize table had been overturned, its contents scattered across the grass. Someone had been searching for something, and they had not been concerned with being neat about it. Recent disturbance, Inspector Craddock observed, examining the scattered items. This happened after we finished processing the scene. Miss Marple was crouched beside the overturned table, her flashlight playing over the jumbled prizes. "Inspector, what's missing?" They took inventory of the scattered items, comparing them with the list that Mrs. Hartwell had provided earlier in the day. Most of the donated prizes were still there. The hand-knitted sweater, the bottle of elderflower wine, the jars of marmalade and chutney, but several items were conspicuously absent. "The Georgian crystal paperweight is gone," Inspector Craddock noted. "And that silver cigarette case we found in the Colonel's safe, that was supposed to be here originally, along with several other items that Mrs. Pemberton had borrowed from village houses." Miss Marple stood, brushing grass stains from her dress. "Someone has been collecting evidence, Inspector, but evidence of what?" The answer came to her suddenly, with the sort of clarity that often accompanied her most important insights. The scattered raffle tickets in the colonel's hand, the careful arrangement of lavender sachets, the precision of the murder itself, all of it pointed to a killer who was not just eliminating a threat, but making a statement. "Inspector," she said urgently, "we need to return to the parish records. There's something we missed, something about the timing of all this." They hurried back to the church, Miss Marple's sense of urgency growing with each step. In the vestry office, she pulled out the same records they had examined earlier, but this time she was looking for something different. "Here," she said, pointing to an entry from exactly 50 years ago. July 18, 1905. The death of Jeremiah Pemberton, the original donor of the village green. Inspector Craddock read over her shoulder. According to the parish records, Jeremiah Pemberton had died at the age of 78, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. But it was the cause of death that made them both catch their breath. Murdered by person or persons unknown. "He was killed exactly 50 years ago today," Miss Marple said quietly. On the anniversary of the village's first murder, the records revealed a story that had been carefully buried and forgotten over the decades. Jeremiah Pemberton had not been the benevolent donor that village folklore remembered. He had been a hard man, a factory owner who had made his fortune through ruthless business practices and the exploitation of workers. His donation of the land for the village green had not been an act of generosity, but a calculated attempt to buy respectability and secure his legacy. But Jeremiah had made enemies, and one of them had finally exacted revenge. The killer had never been caught, and over time the story had been sanitized, the victim transformed from a grasping industrialist into a philanthropic gentleman. "Someone in this village knows the true story," Miss Marple said. "Someone who sees themselves as finishing what was started 50 years ago." Inspector Craddock was studying the faded newspaper clippings that had been filed with the parish records. The original murder was remarkably similar to today's. Jeremiah Pemberton was stabbed in the back with a letter opener during the village's midsummer celebration. His body was found in a tent that had been set up for games and prizes. "History repeating itself," Miss Marple murmured. But why? What connection could there be between Jeremiah's murder and the colonel's death? The answer, when it came, was so obvious that Miss Marple wondered how she had missed it. She turned to the front of the parish register, where marriages and baptisms were recorded, and began working backward from the present day. There it was in careful copperplate handwriting, the marriage of Gladys Helena Morrison to Herbert George Hartwell, performed on September 15, 1923. And in the margin, in different ink and clearly added later, a note: "Bride is granddaughter of Sarah Morrison née Whitmore." "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "Mrs. Hartwell is related to the colonel." They traced the family connections through the records, following the tangled web of marriages and births that connected the major families of St. Mary Mead. What emerged was a story of revenge that had been simmering for generations. Sarah Morrison, Mrs. Hartwell's grandmother, had been Jeremiah Pemberton's housekeeper. According to the records, she had been dismissed without references just weeks before Jeremiah's murder, allegedly for stealing from her employer. The dismissal had ruined her reputation and made it impossible for her to find other work. She had died in poverty 10 years later, her name never cleared. But Sarah Morrison had been the sister of Colonel Whitmore's grandfather, making the Colonel and Mrs. Hartwell distant cousins. And according to a letter filed with the parish records, a letter that Sarah had written to the vicar shortly before her death, she had been innocent of the theft charges. Jeremiah Pemberton had dismissed her not because she was stealing, but because she had discovered his plans to defraud the village by falsifying the terms of his land donation. She knew about the altered records, Inspector Craddock said. She tried to expose Jeremiah, and he destroyed her reputation to silence her. Miss Marple nodded grimly. And now, 50 years later, her granddaughter has learned the truth. Mrs. Hartwell discovered that Colonel Whitmore was not just threatening the village's present, but vindicating her grandmother's memory. He was proving that Sarah Morrison had been right about Jeremiah Pemberton's deception. So why kill him, if the Colonel's research supported her grandmother's claims? Because the Colonel wasn't interested in justice, Inspector. He was interested in profit. He was using the truth about Jeremiah Pemberton not to clear Sarah Morrison's name, but to make himself wealthy through blackmail and development schemes. Miss Marple's voice carried a note of sadness. Mrs. Hartwell saw him as betraying her grandmother's memory a second time. They sat in the quiet vestry, surrounded by the accumulated records of centuries of births, deaths, marriages, and scandals. The weight of history seemed to press down upon them, all those carefully documented lives and loves and losses that made up the true story of St. Mary Mead. "We need to confront her," Inspector Craddock said finally. Mrs. Hartwell lived in a substantial Edwardian house on the far side of the village green, surrounded by the sort of elaborate garden that spoke of both considerable skill and considerable leisure time. Even at this late hour, lights were on in several rooms, and smoke was rising from the chimney. She answered the door herself, still wearing her afternoon dress but with an apron tied over it, suggesting that she had been busy in the kitchen. Her grey hair had come loose from its usual severe bun, and there were flour stains on her hands. "Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock. Rather late for social calls, isn't it?" Her tone was brisk and efficient, the voice of someone accustomed to organizing committees and managing volunteers. "I'm afraid this isn't a social call, Mrs. Hartwell," Inspector Craddock said gravely. "We need to discuss your actions this afternoon and your family's connection to Colonel Whitmore." For just a moment, Mrs. Hartwell's composure flickered. Then she stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. "I suppose you'd better come in then." The sitting room was exactly what one might expect of the president of the Women's Institute. Chintz-covered furniture, family photographs in silver frames, and a display cabinet filled with the sort of china that was brought out for special occasions. But Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to a particular photograph on the mantelpiece, an elderly woman in Victorian dress with a face that bore a distinct resemblance to Mrs. Hartwell. "To your grandmother," Miss Marple said. It was not a question. Mrs. Hartwell followed her gaze to the photograph. "Sarah Morrison. She raised me after my parents died in the influenza epidemic of 1918. A remarkable woman, though the village never recognized it. She worked for Jeremiah Pemberton. She worked for that monster, yes, and he destroyed her for trying to do the right thing." Mrs. Hartwell's voice carried decades of suppressed anger. She spent the last 10 years of her life in poverty and disgrace because she had the courage to expose his lies. Inspector Craddock settled into one of the chintz-covered chairs. "Mrs. Hartwell, we know about the letter opener, about your presence near the raffle tent this afternoon, about your family connection to the Colonel. What we need to understand is why." Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on her grandmother's photograph. When she spoke, her voice was steady and controlled, the voice of someone who had thought long and carefully about what they were going to say. "My grandmother was a good woman, Inspector. Honest, hard-working, devoted to her family and her faith. When she discovered that Jeremiah Pemberton was planning to cheat the village, to donate land for a market, while secretly ensuring that the trust terms would allow him to reclaim it later for development, she tried to stop him. By going to the authorities, by confronting him directly. She thought she could appeal to whatever conscience he might possess. Mrs. Hartwell's laugh was bitter. "She was naive, Inspector. Jeremiah Pemberton had no conscience. Instead of listening to her concerns, he dismissed her without references and spread rumors that she had been stealing from him." Miss Marple leaned forward, and no one believed her story. Who would believe the word of a dismissed servant against that of the village's great benefactor, especially when he had physical evidence of her alleged theft, items that he had planted in her room himself? The parallels to the present situation were becoming clear. Just as Jeremiah Pemberton had used false accusations of theft to silence Sarah Morrison, Colonel Whitmore had used evidence of actual theft to manipulate Mrs. Pemberton and others. You discovered that Colonel Whitmore was your cousin, Inspector. Craddock said, I discovered that he was Sarah's great-nephew, yes. When he first arrived in the village, I hoped that he might be interested in clearing the family name. When I learned about his research into Jeremiah Pemberton's activities, I thought justice might finally be served. But the Colonel had other plans. Mrs. Hartwell's face hardened. The Colonel was just another version of his great-great-uncle. He had found evidence that would have vindicated my grandmother, that would have exposed Jeremiah Pemberton's fraud and cleared Sarah Morrison's name. But instead of seeking justice, he chose to use that evidence for profit. He was blackmailing people. He was threatening to destroy lives and livelihoods unless people paid him to keep quiet, just as Jeremiah had threatened to destroy my grandmother unless she kept quiet about his fraud. Mrs. Hartwell stood and walked to the window, looking out at the village green where the day's events had unfolded. I couldn't let it happen again, Inspector. I couldn't stand by and watch another Pemberton destroy innocent people for money. Inspector Craddock made careful notes. Mrs. Hartwell, I need you to tell me exactly what happened this afternoon. She turned from the window, her face calm and resigned. I had been planning it for weeks, ever since I realized what the Colonel was doing. The Summer Fête seemed appropriate. It was 50 years to the day since Jeremiah Pemberton was murdered at the village's midsummer celebration. A sort of poetic justice, you might say. You took the letter opener from the raffle prizes. I donated it specifically for that purpose. It had belonged to my grandmother, one of the few valuable things she owned before Jeremiah Pemberton destroyed her life. It seemed fitting that it should be the instrument of justice. Miss Marple was studying Mrs. Hartwell with a mixture of sadness and understanding. You arranged to meet the Colonel in the raffle tent at 3 o'clock. I sent him a note that morning, saying that I had decided to accept his offer of partnership in his legal action against the village properties. I suggested we meet privately to discuss terms. Mrs. Hartwell's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were describing the organization of a church bazaar. He was delighted, of course. He thought he had found another victim to exploit. And when you met him, I told him the truth about who I was, about what I knew of his family history and mine. I explained that I had evidence of his blackmail activities, and that I was prepared to expose him just as my grandmother had tried to expose Jeremiah Pemberton. Mrs. Hartwell paused. He laughed, Inspector. He actually laughed and said that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, that I would end up just as ruined as my grandmother if I tried to oppose him. So you killed him. I executed him. There is a difference. Mrs. Hartwell's voice carried absolute conviction. The Colonel had made himself judge and jury over this entire village, using the past to hold the present hostage. Someone had to stop him, and the law clearly wasn't going to do it. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook. In all his years of investigating murders, he had rarely encountered a confession delivered with such calm certainty. Mrs. Hartwell showed no signs of guilt or regret, only a quiet satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Mrs. Hartwell, he said formally, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Colonel Archibald Whitmore. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Mrs. Hartwell looked once more at her grandmother's photograph. I kept my promise to you, grandmother, she said quietly. The truth has finally come to light and the guilty have been punished. Miss Marple remained in the sitting room after Mrs. Hartwell had been taken away, studying the photographs and mementos that told the story of a life devoted to service and respectability. On a small side table, she found a leather-bound journal filled with Mrs. Hartwell's careful research into her family history, pages of notes about Jeremiah Pemberton's fraud, and copies of letters that Sarah Morrison had written but never dared to send. The final entry, dated just 3 days earlier, read, "Justice delayed is not justice denied. Grandmother, your name will be cleared, and the guilty will answer for their crimes. The wheel has come full circle." Inspector Craddock returned an hour later, looking weary and troubled. "She's confessed to everything," he told Miss Marple. "Complete details, no attempt to justify or minimize what she did. She even told us where to find the missing stolen goods. Apparently she had been collecting them as evidence against Mrs. Pemberton and the others, planning to use them to support her blackmail claims against the Colonel. And how is she now?" "Calm. Peaceful, almost. She asked me to ensure that her grandmother's story is told properly, that the truth about both murders is recorded accurately in the official records." Inspector Craddock rubbed his temples. "In 30 years of police work, Miss Marple, I've never encountered a case quite like this one." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She had been thinking about justice and revenge, about the ways that the past could reach forward to shape the present. Mrs. Hartwell had waited 50 years for the opportunity to balance the scales, to complete what her grandmother had started. In her mind, she had not committed murder. She had executed a sentence that should have been carried out decades earlier. "What will happen to the others?" Miss Marple asked. "Mrs. Pemberton, Mr. Clement, the questions about the property rights? Mr. Clement will face charges for the theft ring, of course. As for Mrs. Pemberton," Inspector Craddock sighed, "her situation is more complicated. The items she took were relatively minor, and given her circumstances and the fact that she was being blackmailed, I suspect the court will be lenient. And the village green. That's for the lawyers to sort out now. Without the Colonel to push his claims, and with Mrs. Pemberton's legal standing uncertain, it could take years to resolve. In the meantime, life in St. Mary Mead will go on much as it always has." Miss Marple walked to the window and looked out at the village green, now dark and quiet under the stars. The remnants of the day's fete had been cleared away, leaving only the ancient oak trees and the well-tended grass that had witnessed so much history, so much human drama played out across the centuries. "Inspector," she said quietly, "do you think Mrs. Hartwell was right? About justice, I mean?" It was a question that would trouble Inspector Craddock for years to come. In legal terms, Mrs. Hartwell was clearly guilty of murder. But in moral terms, the situation was far more complex. The Colonel had indeed been using his research to exploit and manipulate innocent people, just as his ancestor had done 50 years earlier. He had shown no mercy to those he threatened, no concern for the lives he was prepared to destroy in pursuit of profit. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "The law is clear about murder, regardless of motive, but sometimes I wonder if the law and justice are quite the same thing." Miss Marple continued to gaze out at the village green, her thoughts turning to the patterns of human behavior that she had observed over 7 decades of life. People, she reflected, were remarkably consistent in their fundamental nature. The same greed, the same desperation, the same capacity for both cruelty and unexpected nobility that had driven Jeremiah Pemberton and his housekeeper still operated in their descendants. "Perhaps," she said, "the real tragedy is not that Mrs. Hartwell chose murder as her solution, but that she felt it was her only option. If the Colonel had chosen to use his discoveries to seek genuine justice rather than personal profit, if he had worked to clear Sarah Morrison's name rather than exploit the village's secrets, none of this need have happened." Inspector Craddock gathered up his notes and prepared to leave. The investigation was officially closed, the paperwork would be filed, and St. Mary Mead would return to its normal rhythm of small dramas and petty rivalries. But he knew that the events of this day would cast a long shadow over the village, that people would remember and whisper about the Summer Fête when murder came to call. "Miss Marple," he said as they prepared to part company, "I want to thank you for your assistance. Your insights were invaluable." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I merely observed what was there to be seen, Inspector. The truth has a way of revealing itself eventually, though it sometimes takes longer than we might wish." As she walked home through the quiet village streets, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of secrets and the power they hold over people's lives. St. Mary Mead, like most small communities, had always harbored its share of hidden truths, carefully buried scandals, and family mysteries that were passed down through generations in whispers and half-understood hints. The Colonel's research had threatened to expose not just legal irregularities, but the comfortable myths that the village had constructed about its own past. People prefer their history sanitized, their heroes unblemished, their community stories free of the messier realities of human nature. The truth about Jeremiah Pemberton, that he had been not a generous benefactor, but a calculating exploiter, would he have shaken the village's sense of itself? But perhaps, Miss Marple thought, that might not have been entirely a bad thing. Communities, like individuals, sometimes needed to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves in order to grow and heal. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as news of the arrest spread through the village. By the time Miss Marple emerged from her cottage for her usual morning walk, knots of people had gathered on street corners, in shop doorways, and around the village green, all engaged in the sort of intense speculation that murder invariably generates in small communities. Mrs. Pemberton, looking haggard but somehow relieved, was seen leaving the police station with her husband's arm around her shoulders. The vicar himself appeared to have aged years overnight, his face bearing the weight of learning about his wife's activities and his family's tangled legal heritage. Dr. Haydock was making his rounds with his usual professional demeanor, though Miss Marple noticed that he seemed less burdened than he had the day before. With the Colonel dead and Mrs. Hartwell under arrest, the threats to his property and livelihood had effectively vanished. The legal questions about land ownership would take years to resolve, if they ever were resolved at all. At the post office, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Fletcher, the postmistress, who was clearly bursting with curiosity and gossip. "Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "is it true what they're saying about Mrs. Hartwell? That she planned the whole thing for months?" "I believe the police have made an arrest," Miss Marple replied diplomatically. "Beyond that, I think we should allow the legal process to take its course." But Mrs. Fletcher was not to be deterred by such discretion. They say she kept a journal, documenting everything the Colonel was doing, planning her revenge like some sort of avenging angel. She leaned closer confidentially. "Do you think it's true what people are saying about her grandmother, about the first murder?" Miss Marple considered her response carefully. The truth about Sarah Morrison and Jeremiah Pemberton would eventually come out during Mrs. Hartwell's trial. But for now it remained largely speculation and rumor. "I think," she said finally, "that families often carry burdens from the past that the rest of us know nothing about. Sometimes those burdens become too heavy to bear." As she continued her walk, Miss Marple reflected on the strange symmetry of events. 50 years to the day after Jeremiah Pemberton's murder, his descendant had met the same fate, killed by a member of the same family that had been wronged decades earlier. It was the sort of pattern that seemed too neat for real life, yet here it was, played out in the most ordinary of settings. The village green looked peaceful in the morning sunlight, showing no signs of the previous day's drama. The grass where the raffle tent had stood was slightly flattened, and there were a few forgotten scraps of bunting caught in the oak trees, but otherwise it might have been any normal summer morning in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple found herself wondering about the future of the village. Would the legal challenges to property ownership tear the community apart, neighbour turning against neighbour as claims and counterclaims worked their way through the courts? Or would people find a way to put the past behind them and move forward together? She was interrupted in these reflections by the approach of a familiar figure, Madame Zelda, the fortune-teller from the previous day's fete. In daylight and without her theatrical costume, she looked like exactly what she was, a middle-aged woman from Much Benham who supplemented her income by appearing at local events. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice carrying none of the mysterious accent she had affected the day before, "I wanted to thank you." "Thank me? Whatever for?" "For solving the murder before anyone could blame it on me. You know how it is. Strangers at village events are always the first suspects when something goes wrong." Madame Zelda smiled ruefully. "I've been doing the fortune-telling circuit for 15 years, and this is the first time anyone's actually been murdered at one of my events." Miss Marple was curious about something that had been troubling her. "Mrs. Pemberton said that you asked her to bring you lavender sachets yesterday afternoon. Is that correct?" "Oh, yes. I always like to have them around my booth. They create a nice atmosphere, and the scent helps put clients in the right mood for their readings." Madame Zelda paused. "Though I must say, Mrs. Pemberton seemed rather flustered when she brought them over, kept looking around nervously, as if she expected someone to jump out at her. Did you see anyone else near your booth around that time?" "Well, there was a woman in a blue dress who seemed to be watching the raffle tent rather intently. She was standing just behind my booth for several minutes, very still, very focused. I assumed she was trying to work up the nerve to buy some raffle tickets." A blue dress. Miss Marple recalled that Mrs. Hartwell had been wearing a blue dress at the fête, though that hardly made her unique. Half the women in the village had probably been wearing blue. "Did you get a clear look at this woman?" Madame Zelda shook her head. "Not really. I was busy with a client at the time, young Tommy Fletcher, wanting to know if he'd ever be tall enough to play cricket for the county team. But I had the impression it was someone older, someone who moved with confidence. Not a timid person, if you know what I mean." Miss Marple did indeed know what she meant. Mrs. Hartwell had never been timid, never hesitated when she believed herself to be in the right. Even planning and executing murder, she had moved with the same decisive authority that had made her such an effective president of the Women's Institute. As Madame Zelda departed to pack up her remaining equipment, Miss Marple found herself standing, alone on the village green, surrounded by the accumulated history of St. Mary Mead. How many secrets lay buried beneath the peaceful surface of village life? How many old grievances and half-forgotten injustices were still shaping the present in ways that nobody fully understood? The case of Colonel Whitmore's murder was closed, but Miss Marple suspected that its effects would reverberate through the village for years to come. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. Questions about property rights and family histories would linger long after the legal proceedings were concluded, and the knowledge that murder could erupt from the most ordinary of settings would cast a subtle shadow over future village gatherings. Yet life would go on as it always did. Children would play on the green, couples would walk hand in hand beneath the oak trees, and the Women's Institute would eventually find a new president to organize their activities. The rhythms of rural life had survived wars, plagues, social upheavals, and countless personal tragedies. They would survive this too. Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, where her knitting waited on the table by the window, and a cup of tea could be brewed to restore some sense of normalcy to the day. She had seen justice served after a fashion, though it was not the sort of justice that left anyone entirely satisfied. Mrs. Hartwell would face trial, and almost certainly imprisonment, her life of service to the community ending in disgrace. The colonel was dead, his schemes and manipulations ended, but his research raising questions that might plague the village for decades. Mrs. Pemberton would have to live with the shame of her theft, even if the courts treated her leniently. Mr. Clement's carnival would move on to other villages, leaving behind only memories of painted horses and tinkling melodies. And Sarah Morrison, dead for 40 years, would finally have her name cleared, and her story told, though she was beyond caring about vindication. As Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair with her knitting, she reflected on the strange ways that the past and present intertwined in human affairs. The murder at the Summer Fête had its roots in events that occurred before most of the current villagers were even born. Yet it had erupted with shocking immediacy into their peaceful afternoon. Perhaps that was the most unsettling aspect of the whole affair, the reminder that the past was never really past, that old wounds could fester across generations, and that the price of ancient injustices might come due when least expected. The afternoon post brought a letter from Inspector Craddock, written in his careful official style but with a more personal tone than she might have expected. He thanked her again for her assistance and provided some additional details about Mrs. Hartwell's confession and the evidence they had gathered. Most interesting to Miss Marple was his account of Mrs. Hartwell's final statement to the police. She had asked that her grandmother's letters and documents be donated to the County Historical Society, so that the true story of Jeremiah Pemberton and Sarah Morrison could be properly recorded. She wanted history to remember both the injustice and its eventual resolution, even if that resolution had come at a terrible cost. She seems to view herself not as a murderer, but as an agent of historical correction, Inspector Craddock had written. It's a perspective I find both disturbing and oddly compelling. One wonders how many other family grievances are simmering beneath the surface in villages across England, waiting for the right moment to demand settlement. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer, along with other mementos of cases past. In years to come, she would occasionally take it out and reread it, remembering the summer afternoon, when murder came to the village fete, and wondering whether justice had truly been served, or merely vengeance satisfied. The evening brought another visitor, Dr. Haydock, carrying his medical bag and wearing the slightly sheepish expression of someone who had come to offer thanks but wasn't entirely sure how to go about it. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into the chair she offered him, "I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday evening and about everything that's happened." "It's been a difficult time for everyone in the village," Miss Marple replied, pouring him a cup of tea. "More than difficult, revelatory, I think, is the word I'm looking for." Dr. Haydock accepted the tea gratefully. "We all thought we knew each other, knew our own history, knew what kind of people we were. But this business with the Colonel has shown us things about ourselves and our community that, well, that perhaps we'd rather not have known." Miss Marple nodded understandingly. "The truth can be uncomfortable, Dr. Haydock, but it's generally preferable to living with lies, don't you think?" "I suppose so. Though I must admit, there were moments yesterday when I envied those who could simply accept the village's official version of its own history without digging deeper." He paused, looking out at the garden, where roses bloomed in the fading light. Mrs. Hartwell spent 50 years carrying the burden of her family's shame, waiting for the chance to set things right. I wonder if any of us really understood the weight she was carrying all those years. She hid it very well. But then people often do carry their deepest hurts in silence, particularly in small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. Dr. Haydock finished his tea and prepared to leave. At the door, he turned, back with a question that Miss Marple had been expecting. "Do you think she was right to do what she did? Not legally, of course, but morally." It was the same question that Inspector Craddock had posed, and Miss Marple's answer was the same. I think she was wrong to take a life, regardless of her reasons. But I also think that the Colonel bears some responsibility for creating the situation that led to his death. He chose to use his knowledge as a weapon rather than as a tool for genuine justice. And now the village will have to find a way to move forward, knowing more about itself than it perhaps wanted to know, but perhaps also more honest about its own nature than it has been in living memory. As summer deepened and the immediate shock of the murder began to fade, St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its normal rhythms. Mrs. Hartwell's trial was scheduled for the autumn assizes, and in the meantime the Women's Institute struggled to reorganize itself under new leadership. Mrs. Pemberton gradually resumed her activities, though she moved through the village with a subdued air that suggested her ordeal had fundamentally changed her. The questions about property rights remained unresolved, tied up in legal proceedings that would likely drag on for years. But without the Colonel's aggressive pursuit of development opportunities, there seemed less urgency about reaching definitive conclusions. The village green remained what it had always been, a peaceful space where children could play and community events could unfold, regardless of the legal technicalities of ownership. Miss Marple often walked across the green in the evenings, remembering the events of that dramatic July afternoon. Sometimes she would pause at the spot where the raffle tent had stood, reflecting on the strange chain of events that had led to murder amid the innocent pleasures of a village fête. She thought often about patterns, the way human nature repeated itself across generations, the way old wrongs demanded new settlements, the way communities preserved their myths and legends even when those stories concealed darker truths. The murder at the Summer Fête had been both shockingly sudden and decades in the making, a violent climax to a story that began long before any of the participants were born. In her final notes on the case, written in her neat hand in a leather-bound journal that she kept for such purposes, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of justice and revenge. Mrs. Hartwell had believed herself to be serving justice, correcting an ancient wrong, and protecting her community from exploitation. Yet she had accomplished this through the very sort of violence that justice was meant to prevent. The Colonel, for his part, had possessed evidence that could have brought genuine justice to light, could have cleared Sarah Morrison's name and exposed Jeremiah Pemberton's fraud without destroying innocent lives in the present. But he had chosen personal profit over public good, blackmail over honesty, exploitation over justice. Perhaps, Miss Marple concluded, the real tragedy was not that murder had been committed, but that it had seemed necessary to someone who had spent a lifetime serving her community with dedication and integrity. Mrs. Hartwell's crime was not just the taking of a life, but the corruption of her own moral nature by decades of suppressed anger and frustrated desire for justice. As autumn arrived and the village prepared for Mrs. Hartwell's trial, Miss Marple received one final letter connected to the case. It came from a solicitor in London who had been sorting through Colonel Whitmore's papers and had discovered something that cast new light on his activities. Hidden in a safety deposit box were copies of documents that the Colonel had apparently been planning to donate anonymously to the County Historical Society. These papers contained his complete research into the Pemberton family history, including evidence that would have definitively cleared Sarah Morrison's name and exposed Jeremiah Pemberton's fraud, all without threatening anyone's current property, rights or livelihood. The solicitor's letter suggested that the Colonel might have been planning to abandon his blackmail scheme and pursue a different course of action. Perhaps his conscience had finally overcome his greed. Perhaps he had realized that there were better ways to use his discoveries than as weapons against his neighbors. If so, then Mrs. Hartwell had killed him just as he was preparing to do the right thing, a tragic irony that would have to be carried by those who survived him. Miss Marple folded the solicitor's letter and placed it with her other papers from the case. She would share this information with Inspector Craddock, and it would undoubtedly be presented at Mrs. Hartwell's trial, but it would not change the essential facts. A man was dead, a woman had confessed to killing him, and the community they both had called home would have to find a way to heal from the wounds that their conflict had opened. On the anniversary of the murder, exactly 1 year after children's laughter had mixed with carousel music, until one scream cut through the air, Miss Marple attended the village's summer fete. It was smaller than the previous year's celebration, more subdued, as if the community was still processing the events that had transformed their understanding of themselves and their history. The carousel was there again, operated by a different, traveling showman who knew nothing of hidden compartments or stolen goods. Children rode the painted horses with the same innocent joy as always, their parents watching with the sort of protective attention that suggested the illusion of perfect safety had been forever shattered. There was no raffle tent this year. The Women's Institute had decided that the associations were too painful. Instead, they held a simple sale of cakes and preserves, the proceeds going to a fund for village improvements that everyone hoped would help restore some sense of community spirit. Miss Marple bought a jar of Mrs. Pemberton's marmalade and chatted briefly with Dr. Haydock about plans for a new memorial garden that would honor all the village's dead, including those whose stories had been forgotten or distorted over the years. It seemed like a fitting way to acknowledge the complex history that had been revealed, to remember both the victims and the perpetrators of past injustices. As the afternoon drew to a close and the families began packing up their picnic baskets and folding their chairs, Miss Marple took a final walk around the village green. The ancient oak trees stood as they always had, witnesses to decades of human drama played out in their shadows. The grass was well tended, the flower beds carefully maintained, the whole scene as peaceful and picture-perfect as any postcard of rural England. Yet beneath that surface calm lay all the complexity of human nature, the capacity for both great kindness and terrible cruelty, the weight of history and the power of secrets, the endless struggle between justice and revenge, truth and comfortable fiction. The murder at the Summer Fête had ended with justice served, after a fashion. Mrs. Hartwell was serving her sentence in Holloway Prison, her confession having earned her a reduced charge of manslaughter rather than murder. The colonel was dead, his schemes ended, but his research finally put to good use in clearing an innocent woman's name. The village had learned uncomfortable truths about itself, but had survived the knowledge and perhaps grown stronger for the experience. As Miss Marple walked home in the gathering dusk, she reflected on the patterns of human behavior that she had observed over 7 decades of life in St. Mary Mead. People, she had learned, were capable of surprising depths of both nobility and depravity, often within the same individual. Communities could harbor terrible secrets while maintaining facades of respectability and neighborly affection, and the past, no matter how carefully buried, had a way of demanding acknowledgement and resolution. The case of the murder at the Summer Fête had reminded her of all these truths, played out against the backdrop of painted horses and children's laughter, bunting and jam competitions, the eternal rhythms of English village life that continued regardless of the dramas and tragedies that occasionally disrupted their flow. In her final entry in the leather-bound journal where she recorded her thoughts on the cases that came her way, Miss Marple wrote, "Justice and revenge are not the same thing, though they are often confused by those who have waited too long for satisfaction. The colonel's death served neither cause well. It silenced a voice that might have spoken for truth, and it transformed a woman of principle into an agent of violence. Perhaps the real lesson of this affair is that injustice, like infection, spreads if left untreated, corrupting not just its immediate victims but generations yet unborn. The price of letting wrongs fester is always higher than the cost of addressing them honestly when they first occur. She closed the journal and placed it in her desk drawer, among the other records of cases solved and mysteries unraveled. Outside her cottage window, the village green lay peaceful under the stars, giving no sign of the drama it had witnessed or the truths it had helped reveal. Tomorrow would bring its own small mysteries and human complications, the endless puzzles of personality and motive that made life in St. Mary Mead never quite as simple as it appeared, and Miss Marple would be there to observe and understand, to see through facades and comfortable lies to the complex realities underneath, ready as always to help truth find its way into the light, however uncomfortable that truth might prove to be.